Saving Grace and Me, written and read by John Coutanche. I wasn't best pleased when Mrs. Williams knocked my door. She is unquestionably the nosiest woman in the village, and I had no intention of inviting her into my cottage. "Hello, Mrs. Lovett. I suppose you've heard about the evacuees?" "I have heard that some children are coming here in the next few days, yes. It's tomorrow, and we're looking to accommodate 38. They'll be arriving on the 4 p.m. train from Manchester. How many can you take?" "Me? I don't know. I assumed they would go to families, and as you know, it's just me and Patch living here." "We're all sorry about the loss of your husband, Mrs. Lovett, but you do have a spare bedroom, don't you?" Mrs. Williams attempted to gaze past me into the interior of the cottage, but a warning growl from Patch, my Asian bull terrier, gave her second thoughts. "Yes, I do, but it's only been 6 months since my husband, well, you know, and I'm not sure whether I'm ready to take in a child. There is a war on, and we all have to do our bit, Mrs. Lovett. I know it's not ideal, but hopefully it won't be for long. I'll put you down for one then. Be at the church hall tomorrow by 4:15. See you there." I closed the door and, topping up my G&T, sank into the nearest armchair. That bloody woman. It seemed as though I had no option, but how on earth was I supposed to cope with an evacuated child? The following afternoon, I was a little late arriving at the town hall. Patch sniffed at every lamppost, and if truth be told, I wasn't exactly hurrying in the hope that all the children would be allocated by the time I got there. It wasn't to be. "Mrs. Lovett, better late than never. This girl is yours. Her name's Grace. She's 7, and I believe she's had a little accident." "Thanks, Mrs. Williams." I smiled at the child. She seemed incredibly small, with unkempt black hair, a grubby face, and stony expression. "I've been waiting, Mrs." "I'm sorry I'm a bit late, but come on, pick up your suitcase and gas mask and let's go." Grace gave an exaggerated sigh and stood up. "Me mum says to keep away from dogs. They smell and they bite you." Mrs. Williams couldn't resist butting in. "He doesn't smell as bad as you, and start showing some gratitude to Mrs. Lovett." "It's okay. Patch has regular baths and he's never bitten anyone. Now come on before it gets dark." We made a slow but semi-dignified retreat, Grace stopping every few seconds to pull up her socks, and eventually arrived at my cottage. "Right, Grace, I'll show you your room, and then it's time for a bath and supper. What have you got in that case?" The answer was very little. Another well-worn dress and nightie, underwear, a ragged towel and a toothbrush, not even a teddy. Grace stood defiantly in front of me. "Me mam says too many baths are no good for you, missus." "Well, you certainly need one now. Come on, I'll run it for you." An hour later, washed, fed, and ready for bed, Grace at least looked respectable, and she had managed to find the nerve to give Patch a stroke and a tickle behind the ears. I saw her gaze to the wedding photograph above the fireplace. "Me mum says to tell you I don't need to go to bed till late, missus. Is that your husband in the photo?" "It was, Grace. He was killed in March. He was in the RAF and his plane crashed." She nodded. "Sorry, missus. Me mum says I ask too many questions." I couldn't help but smile. "And what does your dad say?" "Dunno, missus. I've never seen him. Me mum says he was a waste of space and not worth a wonky penny." I decided against pursuing it. "So what does your mum do?" "She works in a factory making all sorts of things for the war effort. Mum says she's doing all right for herself and not to worry." "Well, good for her. I'm off to bed. I think I've got an old teddy in the cupboard that I had when I was your age. Do you want to borrow it?" "My mum says..." "Yeah, all right. No problem. But I can't have you calling me Mrs. all the time, can I? How about Auntie Jane?" Over the coming weeks, we slowly settled into something of a routine, and I noticed that the gin bottles were lasting a lot longer. With a bit of wholesome Welsh country food inside her, Grace seemed to be putting on a few pounds, and she and Patch had taken a real fancy to one another. Despite her small stature, she was intelligent, and her confidence was definitely improving. I helped her write a few letters to her mother, but nothing came back. "Me mum says not to expect any letters because she's too busy." "Well, never mind. We'll keep writing and telling her how you're doing anyway." Christmas 1940 arrived, and not even the hint of a present from Manchester. Fortunately, apart from leaving behind his beloved dog, David had left me enough money to run the cottage and get by comfortably, his family being something in the motor trade. I also had my income as a magazine writer, and with a bit of effort, I managed to get hold of some basic but overpriced presents for Grace, including a doll and some warm clothing. She started in the local primary school, and I was delighted to see her mix in with some of her Mancunian colleagues and the local children. It also gave me some time for my writing, although I did find myself clock watching for home time. Finally, we received a note advising that Grace's mother, Ms. Baker, would be coming to pay a visit on the 12th of March. She was thrilled. Me mum said she wouldn't forget me, Auntie Jane. Do you think she'll take me back? No, I don't, Grace, not yet. Manchester is still a dangerous place, and your mum will want to make sure you're safe. I secretly hoped I was right. I didn't feel it appropriate to go into details with Grace, but Manchester was a major target for the Luftwaffe. And anyway, I had to admit that I didn't want her to leave. In truth, since she had turned up on that train, she had given me back a reason to live and to enjoy waking up each morning. The big day finally came, and I had no difficulty in persuading Grace to take a long soak and put on her new dress and shoes. She looked much more radiant than the scared young girl who had arrived only 6 months earlier. You look lovely, Grace. I doubt if your mum will even recognise you. Me mum says, once a baker, always a baker. She'll recognise me all right. Yeah, I suppose so. Now why don't you go outside and play with Patch until she turns up? But no getting dirty, mind. The knock came an hour or so later. I wiped my hands on my apron, having just placed some pasties in the oven, and went to answer. But it wasn't Mrs. Baker. Instead, I came face to face with Mr. Jones, the local policeman, and a tearful Mrs. Williams. It turned out that the Trafford Park area of Manchester had taken a pounding the previous night, and scores were missing, including Mrs. Baker. I can't recall how I broke the news to Grace. I do remember that she took it stoically before excusing herself, but when I heard her sobbing into her pillow, it almost broke my heart. When she came into my life, she certainly helped me, and now it is my turn to return the favour. And I did. Slowly but surely we made progress. Some big steps, others minuscule, but 6 months later I could see that she was returning to her brilliant self. One of the key targets was persuading her that she wouldn't be sent to an orphanage. I made it abundantly clear that that was never going to happen. Me and Grace were both a team and a family now. I hadn't been fortunate enough to conceive in the few months I was married to David, but I had a duty to do everything I could for her, and I knew I would. She approached me one morning just before leaving for school. Auntie Jane, can I call you something else now that you're looking after me for good? I don't know, love. What do you have in mind? Well, not ma'am. I was thinking of mum. Yes, I think that would be lovely, Grace. Now off you run. You don't want to be late. I was glad that she didn't see the stream of tears cascading down my face as she skipped off to catch up with her friends. Hey, you lot. Me Auntie Jane says I can call her mum now.